I feel better when I consume more protein. It keeps my hunger in check. Do you think that this paradigm of prioritizing protein is a smart one?
I personally think protein is a good thing to prioritize for most people. You're going to be hungry if you don't get enough protein. There's just no question about that.
The increased CO2 in the atmosphere, which is essentially plant food, is leading to a form of obesity for our crops. And we're in turn eating those crops. It's leading to this milieu of our species ultimately being overfed but undernourished.
So that's exactly right. These foods need to be nutrient rich and not causing this overconsumption or the chronic disease risk that's blowing up today.
A lot of myths circulating on social media today. Some of the bigger and more prominent myths that you wish would just die.
Everybody should be vegan, or if you want to be healthy, you should go all vegan. I don't think that's true. I think that there's a lot of evidence that the more extreme you go on the plant-based side, the greater your risk is for B12 deficiency, calcium, a lot of nutrients, right? Here in the US, we have deficiencies. We have vitamin D deficiency. We have iron deficiency. The list goes on. You look at the UK, folate deficiency, vitamin D deficiency, iron deficiency. We didn't evolve to sort of eat foods that didn't meet our basic requirements. So what's going on there? The answer to how can we transform the diet is pretty simple. If you think about it, it's just...
Ty Beal, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Hey, doing great, Max. Thanks. Good to see you.
It's great to have you. We're friends offline, of course, but you're a nutrition scientist. For anybody who is unfamiliar with you, you have a body of work that I admire. I often cite. I follow very closely, and I implore everybody listening to do the same. But we live in very confusing times with regards to nutrition. There are a lot of competing voices today on social media. There are mixed messages, even from the mainstream media, the legacy media. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to have somebody with your cred come in and set the record straight on a number of different topics for us and kind of put us on a path towards greater clarity and pragmatism when it comes to how one ought to eat for better health and a longer lifespan.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah, well, I guess a good place to start is, why do you think people are so polarized when it comes to nutrition today? From carnivore to vegan and everything in between, there seems to be a lot of noise at the margins. Why do you think that's the case? Yeah,
that's very true. Food is very personal to people. I think when somebody changes their diet and they address some sort of health issue, maybe it's a chronic condition, maybe they lost a bunch of weight, I think it makes people really passionate. They suddenly become evangelists. Like, I did this diet and it's amazing. It worked for me. It'll work for you. And I think what people kind of fail to realize is that there's tons of variation in the population. If you think of the U.S., in for any given person, one particular diet may be great for them and it may be terrible for somebody else. And there's a bunch of reasons for why that is. It's genetic variation. There's the history of how we've been eating, how our body reacts to different foods. And it's just, it's very clear that everybody has a different optimal type of diet. And so I think when somebody changes their diet and let's say they've gone on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet and it really resolved all of their issues, that's powerful. And they want to share that with everyone else. Most people don't really do well in the extremes. Most people are not going to do well on a full carnivore diet. They're not going to be able to maintain that, or they're going to have some sort of, unintended consequences. On a vegan diet, most people aren't going to do well on that diet. They're going to have nutrient deficiencies. They're going to feel drained or tired. And so I think just when you think about public health, the public perspective, what should most people be eating? It's usually somewhere in the middle. And the margins are, of course, there's room for everyone to eat from vegan to carnivore. But most people are going to be eating an omnivore diet somewhere in the middle, focusing on nourishing foods, a mix of plant and animal source foods to meet their nutritional requirements.
Yeah, it's so true. If you had, because right now, there's a lot of talk about what the key needle movers are going to be when it comes to actually making America healthy again. Because, this is not a trivial endeavor, right? This is not an endeavor that... I think that it's really important that we're talking about this. When you look at public health statistics, we're not doing well. 1 in 2 people almost, by the year 2030, 1 in 2 people will be not just overweight, but obese. half of us have some, either pre-diabetes or full-blown type 2 diabetes, or we're on their way there with insulin resistance and the like. So if you had 60 seconds in front of the whole country and you had to, offer your take on what the simplest paradigm is for healthier eating, what would you say?
That's a great question. I really think it comes down to you can have the biggest impact going from the standard American diet that is full of junk food, often called ultra-processed foods or highly processed foods. Just cutting down on those foods, you don't have to eliminate them, but get down to like 10% of the diet and just eat a variety of nutritious foods, of minimally processed foods. Different words probably mean things to different people. So you may say to a more health conscious person, you want to have minimally processed foods. If you're talking to a general person, you may say fresh foods, like have a lot of fruits and vegetables. You can have legumes, which are beans, peas, and pulses. You can have nuts and seeds. You can have fresh meats. You can have eggs. You can have poultry. You can have dairy products. All of that, minimally processed, generally is going to reduce the chronic disease burden, increase the nutritional content and density of the diet overnight if you were to just make that change, right? The challenge is, how do you actually make, when you say move the needle, how do you make a change in that? The food environment that we're surrounded in basically makes it almost impossible to make that transition. You're surrounded by products that are addicting, they're appealing. Once you start eating them, it's hard to stop. There's marketing behind this. There's a whole industry behind this. We live in a society, unfortunately, where people are very lonely. We're working around the clock. We're eating at our desk. We're just grabbing the package so that we can get enough calories to keep going. And that's setting us up for failure. So I think trying to, think about how do we actually do this? Well, can we have more community type things? Can we slow down? Can we cook our own food? I think you're a great chef. You cook a lot of your own food, right? Like that takes time. That takes a lot of behavior change, and that's not easy. And so I think it's like the answer to how can we transform the diet is pretty simple. If you think about it, it's just how do you actually do it? How do you get people to go from what they're eating now to what we know is going to make a big difference?
It's simple, but it's not necessarily easy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We often talk about ultra-processed foods. How would you define ultra-processed foods for somebody who's never heard the term?
Yeah. Well, right now, the FDA and the USDA are soliciting comments for a new definition of ultra-processed foods, something that can be maybe a bit more consensus around, because right now there's a lot of debate. Right? So ultra-processed foods are generally these combination of industrially processed, extracted ingredients. So rather than having, say, corn or the grain, it's like it's been refined, it's been basically extracted of a lot of the nutrition, and it's these really cheap ingredients that are put together into really palatable, addicting, tasty type of products, right? So they're things like chips, packaged chips, donuts, soda, so these like sugar-sweetened beverages, things like that.
Isn't there, correct me if I'm wrong, but is there not controversy around whether or not ultra-processed foods are actually addictive? Or is that just what I gather from social media, where everything seems like, you could say the sky is blue, and that becomes a controversy?
Nutrition has a lot of polarization. So, of course, the proponents are, people who are really supportive of this say, look, it's like everything within these products has a problem. So even if it's not this addictive type of property, these additives, the emulsifiers, the artificial, ingredients, colorants, all of those, there's science that says that they can cause different diseases, right? The biggest issue in my view is that what you're talking about, it's like this overconsumption. If these foods, when you look at the studies, the randomized controlled trials, it really does suggest that if your diet is primarily these products, most people overeat. Most of the studies, like 500 to 800 calories a day more than a minimally processed diet. So I think that the controversy really comes on the other side, that folks will say, well, look, there's all sorts of products that you can make at home that are not considered ultra processed, right? You could make cookies. Try taking a plate of cookies. I don't know about you. If I had a plate of chocolate chip cookies, I would probably eat 3,000 calories in one sitting.
Easily, yeah.
Right? And
Same.
that's not necessarily ultra processed, right? And so I think their argument is that, look, it's really about these refined starches, the refined carbohydrates, whether that's the grain that's refined, it's the refined sugar combined with this fat. that doesn't necessarily need to be ultra processed to be harmful. So I think there's really points on both sides. Really, it's like, look, ultra processed foods is a definition that gets, the big picture right. If we were to sort of reduce those foods, I am confident that the health of Americans would improve across the board. But there's a lot of things at the margins, right? Like, it's not just the ultra processing. You can have really refined ingredients. You can have brownies, cake, different things that you make at home that are still going to lead to overeating and metabolic dysfunction.
Yeah, it's so true. Even within the bucket of ultra-processed foods, there does seem to be a signal that some are worse than, and better than others.
Yeah. I mean, one of the worst ones, I think there is probably consensus. The few things there's consensus about is that sugar-sweetened beverages, so just sodas in general, those are one of the worst things. And all of the data kind of aligns. And if you think about it, there's no nutritional value in a soft drink. It's just basically sugar and water. And so that gives you this bolus all at once. It spikes your blood sugar. It doesn't fill you up in any way. So usually you could eat a full meal and you have a Coke and you have 2 Cokes and you have 3. And it's going to give you several hundred extra calories with no real satiety. And so I think if you look at, the range, there's everything from that product to, let's say, an unsweetened soy milk, but there's a soy lecithin in it, an emulsifier. Okay, that's classified as ultra processed. Wildly different, right? The nutrient density of soy milk, high in protein, you have a lot of micronutrients in there as well versus a soda. Now, if those are classified, now that's where the criticism comes, right? I agree. Lumping soda in with unsweetened soy milk is not, it's not the most sophisticated approach. I think there's room for improving and thinking about, well, can we go beyond this ultra processing to really identify what is the most problematic thing with these foods?
Yeah. I'm curious to hear your reaction to an analogy that I often use. I liken the ultra-processed designation to the BMI, which is very nonspecific. It works quite well at the population level as a screening tool, but it's not a diagnostic tool.
Exactly.
Like if you were to look at Joe Rogan or The Rock, which is, I think, the classic example, they might technically, according to the BMI, be obese, but they're clearly not, because
athletes.
They're highly muscled. They've got low body fat percentage. So similarly with ultra processed foods, I mean, it's like a screening. It's a fairly reliable screening tool, but of course, at the margins, there are examples of ultra processed foods that exist that probably aren't necessarily bad for you, and in fact could be quite good for you.
Yeah, and I think there's one way of interpreting the NOVA. The NOVA system is what is used by Carlos Monteiro, who designed this sort of classification of ultra-processed foods. If you think about it more at the diet level, it actually holds up a lot better. So you may have one ultra-processed food in the diet for the whole day. Most people can handle that. That's not going to really drive a lot of chronic disease, right? If you have, you had one bag of chips or something in the whole day. Now, what happens is most of the calories that we consume come from these ultra-processed foods. In the U.S., it's about 60%. So in the studies that look at this, you're comparing a diet primarily of ultra-processed foods to a diet primarily minimally processed foods. And I think when you think of it that way, I mean, most of us are not wanting to never have anything that's rewarding or that's a treat or a dessert or something. And if you minimize these types of products and you look at the dietary level, then it's saying, okay, let's keep most of your foods from these minimally processed nourishing foods, 80%, 90%, whatever it is, right? That's going to go a long way. And there should be no real controversy that is going to lead to better health than a diet dominated by these foods. So if we think about it as at the diet level, I think there's probably a bit more consensus than thinking about, well, this one food right here, this soy milk or this tofu, it's that's ultra processed, but that can be part of a healthy diet. And you're going to get into these debates. And I think that one of the ways to keep it sort of a bit more aligned with people and say, look, can we move the needle? Can we make progress here is really about what is the overall diet? Can we keep the overall diet pretty much a nourishing diet? And then we have treats and different things on the sides.
Yeah. What do you make of the studies? I mean, most recently, I think it was last year that there was this umbrella updated meta-analysis that came out linking ultra-processed foods to 32 negative health outcomes.
Just about everything.
Just about everything. And they couldn't find one single positive health outcome to link them to. I mean, obviously correlation doesn't equal causation, but yeah, how much stock do you put in a study like that?
Well, to me, I look at the combination of evidence. So when we look at randomized controlled trials, it's very clear that a diet primarily of ultra-processed foods leads to overconsumption. Now, David Ludwig and others in the sort of low-carb community will say, and they've published studies and comments on this saying, look, if you look over time, over the 2 weeks of that study or the 1 week of a study, there was one in Japan, the gap between intake in these two different diets, it starts to converge. And so their view is that, okay, if you were to run these for 2 to 3 months or a longer time period, how do we know that the overconsumption in the ultra-processed group is going to carry on? I think that's a valid point. But when you look at all of the evidence that you're citing, these umbrella reviews, when you look at the preponderance of evidence, even though it's at a observational level, you can't really deny that is picking up something here. Everything from cancer, diabetes, heart disease, cognitive function, right? I mean, almost everything, depression, just about everything has been linked. And I think that's really, to me, those two pieces of evidence together says to me, now there may be room, and there is room for debate about the definition and what is the magnitude. And if you were doing these trials over several months, how would that pan out over long term? For me, it still says there's something going on here. This is a signal that we cannot ignore. And so I'm on the side sort of like, I try to sort of stay grounded and sort of somewhere in the common sense realm. It's like, I can't say that ultra-processed foods is a meaningless classification. I can't say that. And at the same time, I don't think it's perfect. There's certainly flaws. What I like about it is it's simple. It's something that you can implement, I think, in an easy way as a general guideline. And that's going to lead to better health for Americans.
Yeah, I often refer to them as vending machine foods.
There you go.
I mean, would this food that you're considering putting in your shopping cart be at home in a vending machine? And those are the kinds of foods that I think you're better off avoiding.
That's right.
What about, I was listening to your wonderful podcast before you came into the studio, and I was listening to an episode that you conducted, an interview that you conducted where you were discussing the dark matter of certain foods, which I think is such a brilliant concept. It was the first time I'd heard it, where you're talking about all of the myriad nutrients, chemicals in foods that are not accounted for necessarily on the nutrition facts label, all the potentially beneficial compounds in whole foods. But how concerned are you about the dark matter in ultra-processed foods? For example, the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the PFAS. I mean, studies show that when people consume more of these foods, they also tend to harbor, higher levels of phthalates and, these chemicals that are these persistent environmental pollutants that we're now starting to learn also have biological effects.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. When you look, most people look at a food that they get at the grocery store, if it's in a package, they may pay attention to the calories, right? Maybe that's all they care about. If they're really sophisticated, they're looking at the protein and the fat or something, right? Maybe the fiber. But that's maybe 3 or 4 compounds. Now, when you look from a metabolomics perspective on foods, they have thousands of compounds.
What does that mean, by the way?
So it's looking at all of the molecules in these products. So it goes beyond even these essential nutrients, which we think of in micronutrients. Those are vitamins and minerals. And it's looking at things like phytonutrients, carotenoids. In blueberries, you have anthocyanins. You have in animal source foods, you have creatine, anserine, taurine, these different compounds that have not been classified as essential in the sense that if you don't get them, you will die. But they have some sort of role in health because we've evolved to eat these foods. And what's fascinating is that what you're talking about is all of these potential harmful compounds in ultra-processed foods, right? And you're even saying like the packaging, the plastic, the phthalates, right? If you're heating that plastic. What many people don't understand or probably keep top of mind is that not only do the ultra-processed foods have these harmful compounds, they actually lack a lot of molecules that the natural whole food contained. And so if you look at these, when you extract ingredients from a food, if you take a soybean and you extract it down into just the oil, and you take corn and you extract it down in just this starch part of that, You lose vitamins, you lose minerals, you lose fiber, but you also lose phytonutrients, and you lose a lot of compounds that are beneficial to our health. And so what's fascinating is that we actually have nutrient deficiencies in the US. 1 in 5 women in the US is iron deficient. And that's just looking at the essential nutrients. So we have when you look at these studies comparing, for example, one of those kind of plant-based burger that has really ultra-processed ingredients, refined, extracted ingredients versus a beef burger, they're more different than they are similar. And we don't really know what that means. There's very different compounds. And so all of these natural compounds that you would find in animal source foods and fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, all of those types of foods, they're not present in the ultra processed foods. And we don't know what that's doing to us, because a lot of these molecules, if you're to have, let's say you have a steak, right? A lot of nutrients in there. Now, charring meat at high temperature can have some harmful effects. You can have these, different compounds that can cause harm. But if you have a salad with that steak, there's a bunch of phytonutrients that can help detoxify any of those compounds. And so that's one of the things that's sort of missing from this discussion, is we think all about the chronic disease, and that's true. And these are lacking a lot of nutrient density that we would otherwise have had if we were consuming diets from 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's so true. What do you make of the historical demonization of nutrients in isolation in the context of this discussion about ultra-processed foods? So the demonization of sodium, for example, or the demonization of saturated fat.
Yeah. I think what's happened is we have gotten, historically, we've gotten to a point of saying, look, we found that this nutrient, this micronutrient is essential, and this particular nutrient is harmful, at least on average. And what that misses is that we don't just consume nutrients, we consume foods. And food is more than the nutrients it contains. There's a food matrix that matters with how we absorb those nutrients, how we metabolize them. And that really makes a difference. And so there's this word nutritionism, which is what you're talking about. Let's just focus on the sodium and the saturated fat and call it good. But what we've seen is that the food industry can actually adapt to these recommendations and produce products that still undermine our satiety, right? They can still fit low saturated fat, low sodium. They can get the product to look good in some sort of markers of nutrition, and it's not going to be nourishing, and it could cause you to overeat. It could cause metabolic dysfunction. It could cause endocrine disruption. And that's the problem with this nutritionism approach. If you look at just a handful of nutrients, you're missing this whole, for one thing, you're missing these thousands of compounds, this dark matter, and you're missing the whole food matrix. How the form of the food, an apple versus apple juice is quite different. That's not going to have the same effect on the body.
It's so true. But it's also, I just want to point out that, sodium has been demonized and continues to be, I think, in many ways, for decades. And the vast majority of sodium that Americans ingest comes from ultra-processed foods. Yeah. Similarly with saturated fat, which continues, I think, to be unfairly demonized. Saturated fat is not a monolith. Yeah. There are different saturated fatty acids underneath the bucket nomenclature of saturated fat, but only 3% of the saturated fat that your average American ingests comes from lean meat, unprocessed meat. The vast majority comes from burritos and lasagna and pizza and confectionery dishes and the like.
And how do you tease out the effect of the saturated fat versus the pizza, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, a pizza versus a lean steak, very different effects on the body, right? I completely agree. I think even with the sodium thing, if you were to be able to control people's food environment, think about when you're cooking at home. You add your own salt. Our bodies are pretty good at sort of regulating how much do I need, right? You kind of crave salty foods. And if you have this environment where your food is minimally processed, freshly prepared, it's probably hard to be really over consuming salt. What you're saying is that it's actually these products. You get this TV dinner, it may have 2 grams of sodium in it in a single meal. Now, that's probably a problem for a lot of people. Now, it depends on your diet. If you're on a low-carb diet, you can get away with more sodium, right? But I think in general that missing the point, it's sort of like focusing on the isolated nutrient is often missing the point, because nutrition is not that, you can't just break it down into its constituent parts. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. I mean, I eat a primarily whole foods diet. My dietary pattern is probably very similar to what you described earlier, 10 to 20% ultra processed foods. Mm-hmm. So for somebody in my shoes, I mean, sodium actually, like, I feel better when I actually chase sodium as a nutrient and I consume more of it. But, one of the foods that I do enjoy eating, which I guess it's a processed food, maybe even an ultra processed food. I love these gluten-free bagels. Mm-hmm. There's a bakery, no affiliation, in LA called Pop's Bagels. And I was just curious. I looking at the nutrition facts panel to see how much sodium is in that bagel. Mm-hmm. It's not salty. It's not a salty bagel. It's not like it's a plain bagel. It's got almost a gram of sodium in it.
For a single bagel.
Yeah, for a single bagel.
Yeah. And there's a difference between someone, you're probably working out and you have a healthy, balanced diet, right? I think that's very different from someone who's sedentary and eating 80% ultra-processed foods, not sweating very much, not excreting sodium, right? So I think that it's all in context. Also, the thing that related to this matters is the interaction between nutrients. So sodium in the absence of potassium is more problematic than with enough potassium, right? So if you're having your diet, which is like 80 to 90% mix of diverse plant and animal source foods, you're going to be getting a lot of potassium, and that's the protective effect as well of any potential risk from sodium.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when it comes to what we should actually be eating, obviously this is a source of much confusion on social media. Maybe a good sort of framework is to lead with macronutrients, where everybody's talking about protein these days, which I think is a good thing. I mean, based on my appraisal of the literature, my interaction with other experts, and my own, N of one anecdotal experience, I feel better when I consume more protein. It keeps my hunger in check. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this paradigm of prioritizing protein is a smart one?
I personally think protein is a good thing to prioritize for most people. I also think what is probably important is to just acknowledge that there's all this variety. And so if somebody does well on a lower, moderate protein diet, more power to them, right? I think what you're talking about, though, is what are most people going to benefit from. And if you look at the macronutrients, some people do well with lower carb. Some people do well with higher carb. Same with fat. Some people do better with more fat. Some people do better with less fat. I don't think you can really argue that people should be having really low protein. For one thing, like you said, it's a satiety thing. We eat to our protein the minimum protein needs, right? You're going to be hungry if you don't get enough protein. There's just no question about that. And so in terms of trying to make sure you can feel full, which is one of the biggest challenges in the US, right? You said it, almost half of the population is expected to be obese. We have about 2/3, almost about 3/4 of the population now that is overweight or obese. And so there's obviously a big challenge in being able to stop eating when we've met all of our energy needs, all our calorie requirements. I think protein, from my view of the literature too, we're probably preaching to the choir here. Like, you're going to have a hard time eating too much protein. I don't think there's a lot of risk from eating a lot of protein. I think that probably in some patients, right, if you have kidney disease or something, you have to worry about that. But for most people, eating enough protein is going to help regulate how much you eat, how full do you feel. If you think about your lean mass, muscle mass, if you think about performance for athletes, if you think about older adults, you start to have much greater risk of sarcopenia, muscle loss, of falls, of injuries, broken bones. And so protein, from my perspective, for those who want to prioritize protein, I think it's a really safe way to sort of alter the diet from a macronutrient lens and have mostly positive benefits from that.
Yeah. Circling back to ultra-processed foods, I mean, one of the big problems is, I guess the term is greenwashing, marketing an ultra-processed food as healthful when it often is anything but. But I'm curious if you saw that study that came out recently where they took ultra-processed foods that were enriched with protein, and they found that they were less likely to be overconsumed, or they were overconsumed to a smaller degree.
Smaller degree,
Yeah.
right.
Which is, it's an important nuance, because they still ultra-processed foods were still prone to overconsumption. But, protein washing is something that now, you walk through the aisles of your average supermarket, almost every ultra-processed food is like high protein, and a lot of that is BS, in fact, when you look at the nutrition facts label. So that's problematic. But in general, would you say that the enrichment of ultra-processed foods with protein is maybe in a way a net positive?
I think it is. I think you're exactly right that it's better than the alternative ultra-processed food. If you have the combination of the fat and the starch or sugar, so the carbohydrate and the fat, you don't actually see a lot of foods in nature other than breast milk that is high in both. And so we have created these foods to be high in both, and that's super palatable, right? Our bodies aren't used to tasting that combination, right? And so yes, adding protein, I think, to whether that's in the the protein bar, having high protein, whether that's maybe products that wouldn't typically have them, like for example, let's say like an oat milk or some sort of plant milk that is low in protein, I would be much more in favor of having protein powder added to that product. I think that it's going to, for one thing, it's probably going to make it a little bit more satiating. So the overconsumption is going to be reduced a little bit because you'll meet your protein needs sooner. And then for the other thing, there probably are, certain populations like vegans who are at risk of actually not getting enough protein just to meet their essential amino acid requirements. And so I think if we can, and this is actually the argument of a lot of the folks on the low carb side, they say, look, ultra processing itself is not the problem as much. It's really about ultra processed carbohydrates. Those are what are the most problematic foods if you look at them. And so I think there is some truth to that. Your sort of summary of that study, I think, is right. Like, yes, you're still going to overconsume, but not as much.
Yeah. I definitely, of the ultra processed foods that I tend to buy, they're all protein enriched. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Quest protein chips. Mm-mm. Oh my God, whoever formulated those needs to win a Nobel Prize or something.
Are you nominating them?
I'm hereby nominating them. They're incredible. And no affiliation with Quest, but they're a great snack to have at the end of the day, to jack up my protein a little further. And the protein to calorie ratio is amazing. And so, yeah, it's definitely a trend that I'm in support of.
Yeah. I mean, I probably had today from breakfast and lunch about 120 grams of protein. So
wow, that's pretty good.
I do prioritize protein. Now, I'm not like going around saying, you got to have more protein. go to like, you have 200 grams of protein a day. But for me personally, I feel better when I have a good amount of protein. And also, if we haven't really got into this, but when we're talking about vegan, carnivore, if I do too much on the plant-based side and I don't have meat, I start to feel like I'm lacking. And I don't know, could be related to these compounds like the creatine or the taurine or something. There's also this term meat factor, which is like, it's sort of this a little bit mysterious thing that meat can do that for some people it meets their needs in a different way than something else. And so like for me, if I have a meal or two in the day that is just beans or legumes or just tofu or something, I start kind of craving to have some meat. And I think there's something to that where actually the quality of the protein and all of the compounds within those foods themselves are probably contributing something as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. I think that meat is a health food. I mean, it's to be fair, it's a spectrum, but I think that we could even use the qualifier lean. But I think that unprocessed animal source foods or minimally processed animal source foods are, more often going to be beneficial to health than not.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's talk about micronutrients, because this is actually one of your expertises, and I think it's fascinating. You do a lot of work studying how to raise the tide on global nutrient adequacy, which I think is super cool. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
well, a lot of my work starting in my PhD was looking at the global level. When you look at either the food supply, so it's sort of like how many calories of each food are available for the population on average for each person. And so you get this kind of high level picture of what the diet may look like. And when I started that work, we analyzed the risk of inadequacy, kind of some sort of marker of the diet. And we found just huge inadequacies around the world. So these are in things like vitamin B12, in iron, in zinc, in calcium, right? And then we go down to the diet level. So if you kind of measure what people eat, what are you putting into your body, or you model it in some way, you see huge gaps as well. And then you go down into the biomarker level. So now you're testing people's blood and you're seeing, what is your serum ferritin, which is a marker of iron deficiency. You see those nutrients lacking as well. So to me, I think it's a fascinating problem that our food system, the foods that we eat, are not actually dense enough in nutrients to nourish us, to meet the essential nutrient requirements that we need. And what a lot of people are surprised to hear is that, they may think, in Africa, in countries where they don't have access to a lot of foods, that makes a lot of sense. They can't get enough nutrients. And that is where the deficiencies are the highest. You see probably up to 90% of the population has the deficiency. What's surprising is that actually here in the US, we have deficiencies. We have vitamin D deficiency. We have iron deficiency. We have inadequate choline, inadequate magnesium. The list goes on. You look at the UK, folate deficiency, vitamin B12, vitamin D deficiency, iron deficiency. And so there's something going on. Like we didn't evolve to sort of eat foods that didn't meet our basic requirements. So what's going on there? And that's kind of what got me interested in that, is how do we actually rise the tide? What do we do about the diet to change it, to start nourishing people and meeting the basic essential nutritional needs?
Now, do you think that the root cause is isolated to the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods, or do you think that it's goes even broader than that and encapsulates maybe our declining soil health, climate issues and things like that?
It's all of it. So yeah, if you think back to when agriculture started to be the norm in societies, or I guess when society turned into society, not just hunter-gatherers, about 10,000 years ago, when the diets, we know very little about what our ancestors, in the Paleolithic, what they ate from this evolutionary perspective, but we do know that the nutrient density was much higher. And the reason for that is a lot of animal source foods, wild animal source foods, so often lean. You have wild plants, so dark leafy greens, herbs, berries. Now, what we did in the agricultural period when we started is we said, okay, now we know how to cultivate crops. So that's great. We don't need to go out. We don't need to go out and hunt. We don't need to forage. We're going to start growing corn or whatever, wheat, these different crops. Understandably, to make things easier, we wanted higher yields. Let's produce more, as much as we can. Then we add fertilizer and we selectively breed these crops to be higher in starch. We breed the blueberry to be bigger. We breed the apple to be bigger. But what happened there is that the nutrient density declined. Now, that wasn't intentional. But now we're living in this world where the foods that we eat today are vastly different from the foods available a few hundred years ago through that process. Now, there's this term biofortification, nutrient-enriched crops, where we're now starting to breed crops to add back in that nutritional value. And so that's a positive thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is the refining of things. So even if even if the food had the same nutrient density, if you strip you refine the grain, you are going to lose a lot of those nutrients. So we're getting hit by that as well. Now a lot of our foods are processed and even ultra processed, so the nutrients are getting stripped out. You talked about climate. With more CO2 in the atmosphere, that actually reduces the nutrient content, mineral content, iron, zinc, calcium, protein. And so it's not looking good. Like, whatever your view is on climate change, all of the evidence says that as the climate warms, the nutrient content of these crops declines. So we're already struggling to meet our nutrient needs. It's just going to get worse. And then when you talk about, is it just these ultra-processed foods? Now, this depends on where you are. In the U.S., the main cause is that we're eating these ultra-processed foods. They're also nutrient poor. If you're in Africa, in a country where the population wants to eat more healthy foods, but they can't afford it or they can't access it, they're living mostly on starch. Maybe it's corn. It's like most of their calories are coming from corn. And so that's the problem there. It's not the ultra processed foods. It's that they have this one staple and they're not getting the fruits, vegetables, and animal source foods, eggs, meat, fish, dairy that they may otherwise need.
It is so, I love this conversation because it's so elegant and also scary to me that the increased CO2 in the atmosphere, which is essentially plant food, is leading to a form of obesity for our crops. They're growing faster. Mm-hmm. They're becoming diluted of protein, which, by the way, we're becoming diluted of protein if you consider muscle mass, lean mass protein. Mm-hmm. And we're in turn eating those crops, and it's leading to this milieu of our population, our species ultimately being overfed but undernourished.
That's exactly right. We're overfed, undernourished, and we need to address both of those. Sometimes people think about one or the other. It's actually, they're both related. You can nourish yourself and prevent overconsumption. And so I think that's the other side of things too. Like if you're going to be nourishing yourself, the foods need to be nutrient dense because you're not going to be eating a ton of excess calories. You got to get your nutrition into a reasonable amount of overall food. And so that's exactly right. These foods need to be nutrient rich and not causing this overconsumption or the chronic disease risk that's blowing up today.
Are you at all familiar with literature on the satiety impact of various micronutrients? We talk about like protein a lot in the context of satiety, but somebody I follow, Marty Kaplan, I think is his name.
Yeah.
He flagged to me that on X at some point that calcium is very satiating. That among micronutrients, calcium seems to be like the most related to satiety.
I think that makes sense from my understanding, and Marty's great. My understanding is that so let's rewind a little bit. Okay, so the studies where if you've sort of seen looking at wild herbivores and understanding that if you give an herbivore, let's just say, whatever it is, but the herbivore access to a diverse pasture with crops of all different species, they will self-select to meet all of their nutritional needs. Okay. Now, there have been studies in humans. So there's been studies in young children who are just starting to eat food. So, 6 to 23 months of age. And if you put a variety of nutrient-dense foods, just of diversity, maybe some organ meat, some liver, some eggs, dairy, things, they will eat nutritionally what they need. So I think the micronutrients play a role there. The problem is that in our current food environment, like in the US, it's so warped from our ability to just regulate what we eat that I think the micronutrient picture is a small factor. Like if you have, let's just say you fortified all of the ultra processed foods and you added calcium, there's no question to me that people are going to overconsume, right? It's not going to be like, I got my calcium, so I don't want this donut.
And that might lead to other
donut away.
unintended consequences as well, right?
Yeah. So I don't want to say there's no basis in that. I just think it's probably a small piece of the pie, so to speak, if you think about the overall issue with our food environment today.
Very cool. Now, is the solution as simple as everything that we've discussed thus far? Do you think that there's merit to that this warrants supplementation, knowing that even among whole foods, our whole foods are becoming, less and less nutrient dense over time?
Really depends on the nutrient. So some nutrients like iodine, very hard to know how much are in the product that you're eating because it depends on the soil content. The most reliable source is animal source foods like dairy. But if you're not in control, many of these same products, if you grow it in one region, it may have just enough iodine, no problem. And you grow it in another region, it's low in iodine, and you could develop a deficiency. So for those types of nutrients, either having some fortification, so iodized salt, if you don't eat that, having a supplement, probably important just to make sure you can get enough. Other nutrients, it really depends. So like iron, we talked about women of reproductive age, 1 in 5 are deficient. Iron, you don't want to have excess free iron in your body. It can be harmful. What you would want to do in that case is in general, it's preferred to get most of your nutrients through foods. There's a bunch of reasons for that. There's this food matrix effect. Our body is more able to process those nutrients and avoid excess and avoid, But with iron, if you're low, you're going to want to supplement. So it's really about getting tested. Like if you're a woman of reproductive age, 15 to 49 years of age, you should get your iron checked. And if you're low, you supplement if you need to, or you can try to eat more, iron-rich foods. It really just depends. I think vitamin D, if you're getting enough sunshine and you don't have a lot of risk of, sun damage or whatever, that may be enough if you're eating a lot of fatty fish. But for most people, vitamin D, you're going to need to take a supplement or get it through fortification where it's added. You'll see in a lot of milk products, you'll see added vitamin D, right? I take a vitamin D3 and K2 supplement just to make sure I can get it. And of course, if I'm getting a lot of sunlight, I don't need it as much. So yeah, our food today is less nutrient dense than it was. If you just go back in time, it gets more and more nutrient dense. And so yes, there is some, I think, supplementation that's probably required for most people. At the very least, thinking about how can I eat a more nourishing diet and make sure I have my iron needs met, my vitamin D, my it depends on if you're a vegan, for example, you're going to want to make sure you have calcium. You may need to consider adding calcium. So it depends on your overall diet. But I do think that we have to be careful. And even though it's ideal to get it through foods, in many cases, that's not realistic. And people will need to turn to supplementation.
You mentioned iron and vitamin D. What are some other nutrients of concern today?
So in the U.S., it's a lot of plant source ones. So like magnesium, potassium, and
magnesium is incredibly difficult to get from food.
It is. You're gonna actually have a lot of hemp seeds.
Yeah, like how is I don't know if it's the RDA or the RDI, but like how is one on a daily basis to get the amount of magnesium that we need from food? I mean, I supplement with magnesium because otherwise I know for sure I would not be meeting my needs.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It probably has to do with the fact that most people don't consume a healthy diet. And I think with certain nutrients, the RDA is actually hard to meet even with a healthy diet just because of the amount of the nutrients in our foods today. And so, yeah, sometimes you need to supplement. Now with potassium, I think the point is more you should be eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and stuff, right? I don't think I would just say just forget all of that and just supplement with potassium. Like I think that you want to eat whole foods as much as you can.
Well, potassium also is abundant in salmon and beef.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize that.
Yeah. And dairy, other animal source foods too.
Yeah. Man. What would you say I love everything that we're discussing. It's so cool getting to nerd out about nutrition science. A lot of myths circulating on social media today. Some of the bigger and more prominent myths that you wish would just die.
Okay, myths. Huh. Let's see. I think there's some, I don't know if these would be myths, but I think for me, thinking about some of the polarization that I see online are the extremes of sort of everybody should be vegan, or if you want to be healthy, you should go all vegan. And if you care about the environment, you should go all vegan. I don't think that's true. I think that there's a lot of evidence that the lower you go, the more extreme you go on the plant-based side, the greater your risk is for B12 deficiency, calcium, iron, zinc, vitamin D, iodine. I mean, a lot of nutrients, right? So I think there is oftentimes people in the plant-based community can like oversell that sort of go plant-based and it's going to solve all the problems for you and for the planet. Also for the planet, like we need animals to be a part of the system. So, I think that there's reason to moderate, but not eliminate. On the other side, I think the carnivore I would say the myth is that LDL doesn't matter. Your cholesterol doesn't matter. As high as, it can be as high as it wants. As long as your other metabolic markers are fine, you're okay. And so that I think is very clear from my read of the evidence that ApoB, these particles do increase your risk for heart disease. Heart disease is the number one cause of death in the U.S. and in most places around the world. And so I think that there is probably either a myth or at least a sort of dismissal of the evidence around cholesterol, right? you hear, and I think it's been exaggerated on both sides. It's all about cholesterol and cholesterol doesn't matter. I'm like, no, it matters, and it's not all about cholesterol.
I would completely agree with that. I'm so glad that you brought that up.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of other myths out there. I mean, we could get into seed oils and all that stuff. I think we don't have to, but like, I think for me, the biggest problem is the nature of polarization in general. I mean, we have like this culture, even on social media, or especially on social media, of just like rage bait, it's just like, oh, come on. It's like whatever drives attention gets seen. And I think that that's a problem. Like, regardless of what you think about, how many animal products should you be eating? Should you be having seed oils? Should you not? I think if we were more collaborative and constructive with our engagement, or if we did it in person, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've interacted online and it's like, oh, this is terrible. And then you meet them, you're like, this person's great. We agree about 90% of the things. I didn't know this. And it's like the online format is just so problematic. So I think I would just like to see, let's just be human. Let's talk about what we can do that we agree about that will make a difference. And I think if we do that, we're going to move forward and not have these polarized debate, whether it's, on the left or the right. I think that there's a lot that we can agree about. Let's focus there, and then we can have the debates in a healthy, constructive way. But like, let's not just debate just to try to win the argument. Let's debate because there's real controversies around stuff, and we can do it in a civilized way and shake hands and walk away. Like, we don't need to be antagonistic, right? Nobody's going to win from that.
Amen. And one of the things that I love about your approach, I mean, you even, when we began the conversation, you said that you love to bring common sense to the discussion. And I think that there's even polarity within the nutrition science community where it's like, I'm going to be, 100% bound to the nutrition data, neglecting, a sense of pragmatism and logic and common sense. And then there are people who are just basically like all gut, let's ignore all scientific, the entire body of scientific literature. And I think it probably makes a lot of sense, and you're essentially future-proofing yourself and hedging your bets by being somewhere in the middle. Like, listen to your common sense, listen to your intuition, but also like don't completely ignore the scientific evidence. Understand science, Mm-hmm. That's what I'm super passionate about doing, and one of the things that I think is really important in terms of my work with this podcast is fostering scientific literacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think at a gut level, we often know what to do, and it can make sense. And sometimes science is not common sense. Sometimes it actually challenges our assumptions, and we can listen to that. I think that's absolutely right. But certainly there is an aspect of common sense that let's eat whole foods, most of your diet. I think one of the things that is probably lacking is this hyper focus on the biology and what's happening in the body, and like this total like neglect for what is our social, cultural experience, right? Like, our health and our well-being has so much more to do with than just the foods we eat. What are our relationships like? Do we have community? Are we being active? Do we enjoy our jobs? Do we have work-life balance? Do we sleep? All of that stuff matters. So I think that if you hyper-focus on just the food and the nutrients and the saturated fat or the seed oils or whatever, I think you're going to miss the bigger picture. It doesn't mean that those things don't matter, but it just means that let's interpret it all in the context of overall health and well-being.
Yeah, I love your approach. Is there an area where you've changed your mind over the past year, couple of years? Nutrition science is constantly evolving. Science always reserves the right to change its mind. Mm-hmm. So is there any area where maybe you think differently about a topic now than you had in the past? Yeah,
I think that when I got into this field, I kind of entered in through, a lot of people have their own experience where they had some health issues. I had a parasite from traveling, and I had a lot of issues that I had to address, and I started on a paleo diet to sort of address those things. And like a lot of people, I thought, oh, this is great. Mom, Dad, you should try this paleo diet. It's great. Like, this is what you need to do. It's all about the paleo stuff. And then I realized, like, okay, that's my experience. Now, and that's also my experience at this time. So that's one thing I've learned, is that what works for one person, even for themselves, it doesn't mean that that's ideal or optimal for the long term. You may need to go on a diet that transitions you or addresses a health issue, and then you can expand it and be a bit less restrictive, right? So once, I think when I had started getting into the health, I was sort of like, grains and legumes, no thanks, I don't need those. I'll just have nuts and seeds, whatever. Now I'm much more, I think I'm much more balanced, where I actually see, some people do have a problem with those foods, right? You maybe tolerance or whatnot, but for most people, for a lot of people, they're really nourished. They can be really nourishing foods. So that's one area. Also with I think the LDL cholesterol thing, like I think I was a bit more, it's just LDL, it's not a big deal. It's really just about making sure your other metabolic markers are okay and you're eating the right amount of food and just having minimally processed foods. I've sort of come over the years to really appreciate that. I think optimally, we probably do want to have ApoB pretty low. I think if you're trying to optimize your health and you're reducing your risk of heart disease, you probably want that lower. And so I think along with that, saturated fat, I used to view it as sort of like no issue concern, don't worry about it for anybody. Now I think that there's a proportion of the population, they really do have increased risk of something, of the cholesterol thing, for example, with saturated fat. I think it's overblown, but I do think that it matters. That's another area. I think, if I go back to when I first got into it, I actually went to a vegan diet for a few months, just all completely vegan. And at that point I was like, this is great because I cut out all the other stuff. But that's what happens. People go from a sort of more standard American diet. They cut out all the crap. It's like, big surprise that you're feeling better in the short term, It doesn't mean that diet is the optimal diet, right? So I think I've changed my mind as I've seen new evidence come out. And not even new evidence, honestly, most of it's that I actually understood the evidence that was already there. I think that's the big thing. It's like nobody has the capacity to absorb all of the scientific literature on the internet, And so I think for me, it's sort of learning that one of the ways that I've grown from this is working with other scientists, intentionally working with scientists that disagree. One example of this, I was asked by an editor to write a paper on animal source foods and look at the health and environmental benefits and risks. And I'm biased, just like you probably have some biases. We all do. And I thought, let me try to get some other folks who have a different view. So I asked Dr. Christopher Gardner at Stanford. And that experience was great. Like Chris, he was very respectful. We had some back and forth, and I feel like it made the paper stronger. And I think when you can work together with people who see things differently, and you may even disagree about something, you have to strengthen your argument. You have to examine things, and usually there's something you're missing, and the truth is closer to somewhere in between. And it doesn't mean it's like always equally in the middle of whatever, but like that experience, I think, taught me that there's always room to grow. And when you work with other respectful scientists, you can actually get much closer and better product that's closer to the truth than you otherwise would have if you did it by yourself.
Now, do you think that he was also able to see areas that he may have had blind spots to?
Absolutely. He thanked us for working on the project. He left a quote in the press release, and his view was, his sort of interpretation was, wow, there actually are populations around the world that probably would benefit if they had more animal source foods. That was news to him. That wasn't something that he really appreciated. So I think it does go both ways, and I think that what happens is we get into these camps where we're like, I'm going to have all my buddies and we're just going to like say, yeah. Like you and me getting in a room. It's like, yeah. It's all about this, and it's like, you're going to have this group think and it's not going to lead to really balanced views on things. And I see that all the time. I see it online. I see it in scientists. You write papers with your friends and the people that you agree with. And I think it's just so much more productive to work with people you don't agree with, as long as it's done in a way that's constructive and respectful.
Yeah, and that I think is the problem with online, quote unquote, in air quotes, science communicators, is that their approach to collaboration is just creating another reaction slop reel, where they get angry and disrespectful, and that's no way to push the conversation forward.
Yeah.
I've always been I don't create reaction. I mean, you can go to my, you can go way deep into my feed. I've never done a reaction reel where I'm tearing apart somebody else for just having an opinion.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I want to go back to the saturated fat bit, because I completely agree with everything you said. I mean, I've never promoted high saturated fat diets, although I might, the casual observer of my work might think that I may be doing so because I promote animal source foods. But to me, it always made very logical sense that a cow, I mean, this is the best example that I could think of, is when a cow is fed its biologically appropriate diet, it's a leaner animal. So that to me suggests very obviously that animals that are eating what they ought to be eating, and then when we eat those animals, we're ingesting a lower quantity of saturated fat. And even the saturated fatty acids that we're ingesting tend to be more neutral from a cardiovascular standpoint.
And the way the animal was bred also influences how fatty does it become, right? If you think about chickens, they fatten up really quickly. They grow because they were sort of bred to do that. So what they eat, how they were sort of bred to be, right? That all matters. I totally agree. If you go hunting, right, and you get some venison, vastly different, right? Or kangaroo meat, right? So different, and it really does have a different metabolic and health effect than our other products that we've sort of been feeding all this grain to, and not sort of the biologically appropriate diet.
Yeah, like it makes sense to me that one would potentially increase health risks if their diet is comprised primarily of super fatty, industrially produced meat, like feedlot ribeyes.
Yeah.
All day, every day.
Yeah.
And then dairy fat seems to be neutral from a cardiovascular standpoint, with maybe the exception of butter, which we've talked about.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think dairy fat is another key thing that for most people, it's going to be neutral or potentially positive, like even having full fat dairy. That's very different than having really fatty meat all the time. I don't think that like fatty meat is necessarily inherently bad, but I do think you can have too much of it, right? And I think that the source of the saturated fat, so I think about like eggs and dairy, those are great foods. Like all the evidence that I have seen suggests usually pretty neutral or beneficial for the chronic disease side, and they're all very nutrient dense. So they're giving you a lot of essential nutrients that you wouldn't get from other foods.
Amen. Well, Ty Beal, this has been so fun. We gotta do a round two.
Absolutely, happy to.
Yeah. I've got one last question for you, but before we get to that, tell my listeners about your wonderful new podcast and how they can connect with you on social media and consume all of your work, your publications, etc.
Sure. So I have a podcast started called The Ty Beal Show. It's on all the platforms, so on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And I really wanted to just try to cut through the noise, try to have sort of, like you said, this common sense approach. How can we address things that really make sense and don't just sort of get people to pay attention to something because it's like polarizing or it's shocking or something. So I'm trying to stick to that as much as I can. Have guests on that are respectful, different viewpoints. So I will have someone on one side of an issue and on the other side of the issue, and I hope that brings more clarity to and balance to the overall understanding. But that's been really fun talking with people. I'm on X, Ty R. Beal. You can follow me there. And if you want to know my papers, just search Ty Beal into Google Scholar. You'll get a bunch of papers on usually around nutrient density, animal source foods, things like that.
Beautiful. What does living a genius life mean to you, Ty Beal?
I think it's having nutrient dense foods, so dark green leafy vegetables, having organ meats, having fatty fish, shellfish that have the DHA, the EPA, having a balance of minimally processed plant and animal source foods to meet all your nutritional needs, and just avoiding excess. Really just like limit how many unprocessed, ultra processed foods, junk foods that you eat. Have them occasionally because that's great, but don't have them be the primary diet.
Well said. You're the man.
All right. Thanks, Max.
I knew I was going to love this.
That was awesome.
Thanks for coming out. Thank you guys for listening. Share this episode with friends and loved ones that may benefit from it. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice. It's a free way to support. and sending love. I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.